Welcome to another episode of Cross Border Talks, where we will head towards Denmark and we'll speak to one of the leading experts on migration from Denmark, Ahlam Chemlali, who is at the Danish Institute for International Relations, and she publishes in some of the most prestigious international media. We'll be talking about European migration policy, what problems appear with it, social and others. And maybe also we'll talk about the ethical issues that arise from it. So welcome to the program, Ahlam, and I pass the microphone to my colleague Malgorzata, who put the first question.
And before I put the first question, I just remind everybody who is listening or watching us that we are available on YouTube, SoundCloud, Spotify. We are in social media, and as Cross Border Talks is a project entirely supported by us, by the Cross Border team. We also kindly ask you to support the project if you like what we are doing. If you want to see our project going on, then consider it. And hello, Ahlam. It is very nice to have you in the program. And especially now when the migration issue becomes relevant even more than it was. And it is now a heatedly discussed topic in a number of European countries. And some of the heated discussions are connected to the new European Union Migration Pact, on which the member states reached a preliminary agreement in June. This is an agreement presented as a milestone by Ursula von der Leyen. But on the other hand, the number of human rights defenders claim that the agreement is actually a one big violation of human rights. As Human Rights Watch put it, the interior ministers meeting in Luxembourg endorsed policies that will entrench rights violation, increase use of detention and unsafe returns. So one can ask, we can ask ourselves, what is the European Union heading to? Is the European Union going to legalize human rights violation on the expense of the migrants coming to Europe?
Well, thank you. And first of all, thank you for inviting me to your podcast and for discussing these issues that are very timely at the moment. I think the EU Migration Pact is a very interesting case right now. Just recently, the Greek tragedy outside of Pylos, where we know now how Greek authorities have been involved in that, but also pushbacks as far as the Western Mediterranean and the Eastern Mediterranean, and also inside borders, European borders along the Balkan routes. So what the issue is, although it's positive that they are focusing on more solidarity mechanisms within the EU and within EU member states, the problem is that it's very much still relying on outsourcing and externalization. For instance, they are now trying to, create this list, which has been ongoing for years, a safe third country list with countries including Tunisia. As we are seeing right now in Tunisia, the country is not a safe third country for migrants or asylum seekers. So that is very problematic that they're still pushing for quicker deportations, increased detentions, and repatriations to countries that are not safe. So in a nutshell, it's very much like previous policies that will backfire, and it's basically just a continuation of many of these failed policies.
The tragedy in the Mediterranean reminded us all that there are still thousands, perhaps millions of people trying to reach European shores, even at the risk of their lives. And the issue of migrants coming this way was one of the key topics in electoral campaigns in Italy and Greece, who both elected far-right or right-wing, close to far-right governments. My question is the situation in the Mediterranean deteriorating with Giorgia Meloni as the Prime Minister of Italy and Kyriakos Mitsotakis on the head of the Greek government? Or the fact is that the anti-humanitarian policies have been going on no matter who is at the head of the government in these key countries?
Thank you. I think that the situation has worsened. We can also see it in the statistics that the numbers of death in the Mediterranean and disappearances have increased over the years. Since just this year, it's unfortunate, tragic, record-breaking year in terms of the deaths at sea. So it's going in the wrong direction. And also, several reports show that it's become more riskier, more dangerous to cross than it's ever been before. And this is related to the increase in migration control in the Mediterranean, not just, for instance, the EU and especially the Italian member state focusing more on partnering with, for instance, the Libyan coast guards to basically become their coast guards to intercept and push back people back to Libyan shores where we know human rights abuses are taking place. And also, we know just recently that the Libyan coast guard, it has been documented that it's infiltrated with criminal networks and militias. So even though it's very well documented that it's a dangerous group and it's endangering lives, the EU is still openly cooperating and funding the coast guards. So this is very worrying, and since Meloni came into power, of course, her agenda was to stop migration at any cost, and she has also, with her policies, for instance, continued Salvini's policies as well, which is basically to stop rescue operations at sea. It has also, criminalized NGO operations, and many have been, there have been cases where rescue workers or even just civilians or volunteers have been accused of being traffickers for saving lives. So this has become worse and in some cases normalized. We're also seeing now the increase, as I mentioned, deaths linked to that they have, closed off the safe ports. So rescue boats or just boats trying to arrive to a port have been directed for even longer routes, so they have to sail for longer time, which is only increasing the viability of course, shipwrecks or other issues, as we saw with the recent case outside of Pylos in Greece, that the boat was carrying up to 700 people, was told to hold still. The rescue operations or the Greek officials and Coast Guard responded very, very late. And some investigation now, as we're seeing it's ongoing, is showing that unfortunately they have been directly involved in this tragedy as well. So I think the policies are reflecting the reality as well, but also that it is a continuation of what we've seen in recent years. But I do think it has been exacerbated now by, for instance, Meloni's policies, which are very anti-immigration policies, because that's also what will keep her in power in Italy, and the same we are seeing now in the case of Greece as well.
Okay, you are very well aware of what is going on in Tunisia, where a number of issues appeared, and you even wrote an article a few days ago or a week ago on these problems in Tunisia with migration policy in the EU. Could you somehow sum up what is the core problem or the problems in Tunisia with regards to migration?
Yes. Well, Tunisia is also a very interesting case because it was, of course, the lighting example in the region, because it's where the Arab Spring started. It was, the cradle of the revolution. But what we've seen now in the last decade is that the country has really descended into deep crisis, political crisis and economic crisis. And as a consequence, there have been an increase. Some have even called it an exodus of migrants from there, not just migrants from other countries, from West Africa, Central Africa, but also Tunisians themselves who no longer see a future in Tunisia. They are, disillusioned with Tunisia. There is no employment, no job opportunities because of the pandemic as well. Several industries were closed down. And also afterwards, today, as we speak, there have been food crisis across the region, not just Tunisia, but many North African countries have been very dependent for years of, importing cereal, corn, and other, products from Ukraine and Russia. So since the war started there, the food crisis have impacted North Africa substantially. So there have been a bread crisis in Tunisia. When I was there during the fall for field work, the supermarket shelves were empty. You could not get rice or grain or pasta, or so many, basic goods were not accessible. So people can no longer, even middle class people can no longer sustain their families or themselves. And there have been no, political will to change these policies or to reform any economic reforms. So therefore, you have seen an increase in migration from Tunisia. So it's no longer what we've seen historically, Tunisians who leave that are usually poor young men. But now, today, we are seeing middle class, we are seeing families leaving on boats, we are seeing highly educated young people who are leaving irregularly on boats. So there have been a demographic shift. And at the same time, we see, because of regional dynamics, Libya becoming more unstable and Algeria becoming more repressive, that migrants from third countries in West Africa, in Central Africa, are coming to Tunisia because of the insecurity in the countries, for instance, Algeria and Libya. So this has created, you could say, a dual migration pattern in Tunisia, where you both have Tunisians leaving, but you also have sub-Saharan Africans leaving, which has placed Tunisia also in the heart of the European migration policy, because the numbers have been so high, especially this year. Crossings, it has now become and surpassed Libya in the country where most people are leaving to cross from Europe. And this is also why we've seen several visits for Italian MPs and Giorgia Meloni coming to Tunis to discuss migration, and also recently von der Leyen and Rutger from Deutschland. I think he just resigned maybe a few days ago, but they were all in Tunis because Tunis is going to be the most important front line in terms of EU migration and border control.
You have been arguing for a long time against this externalization policy, migration policy of the EU, for maybe which comprises of security cooperation with countries in Africa. It somehow, as I understand, leads to human rights abuses, etc. But why is the EU approaching having this policy in the first place? Why not other type of migration approach?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, because we've seen a lot of research, but also just examples over the years that this policy does not work. And we've seen it globally. It's not just Europe that are using this externalization approach. It's happening in Australia, where they also are offshoring and outsourcing to small islands in the surrounding seas. And then you also see it now in the US with externalization to Latin America and regional, and to Mexico with the Remain in Mexico policies. And the consequences, as we already know, is this: it does not stop migration. It's only making it more dangerous, and it's also increasing the repeat businesses for smugglers, and it's also creating all of these preventable deaths, either in the desert or in the Mediterranean Sea. So we know from research that this policy is not efficient. It's actually, on the contrary, very, very costly, very expensive, and also proven to backfire. In a way, it's also just not just in terms of course, human rights and moral kind of arguments, an issue, but it's also a problem for Europe and for the EU, because they can, increasingly become blackmailed, or so to speak, by many of these, partners, as they call them, migration partners that they cooperate with. For instance, with Turkey, where Erdogan has, pressured or threatened Europe and the EU to either give him more money, or he will open the borders. And the same has historically also been the case with Gaddafi when he was still alive, the former dictator in Libya, where he also would threaten Europe with more, again, money, or he would, make Europe black, as he famously said. And Europe has, the EU has cooperated and funded and supported many of these dictators or authoritarian figures over the years. So it's not anything new. The problem is now that the consequences are being more clear. For instance, recently we also saw how, for last year, I think, in the summer, Morocco kind of used its power against this deal with Spain, where they opened the gates, so to speak, to Melilla, and in the course of 24 hours, more than 8,000 crossed the border, and this, of course, caused a big political issue and scandal. But it also shows how vulnerable the EU can become. Lukashenko also used this against the EU at the border, where he forced, or he kind of, through misinformation, so many planes were arriving from Iraq and other countries to cross in to the EU. I think the Belarus-Polish border, and this was kind of a payback because of the sanctions EU had put on him. So migration issues are also a way to negotiate these geopolitical fights between the EU and other states, that there's so-called migration partnership. So it's a problem that will also backfire on the EU itself, and it's already showing now.
Okay, if this policy is ineffective, leads to suffering and takes human life, what are the alternatives to it, and what are the good examples, if there are any, with regards to migration policy?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and if I had the complete answer, I wouldn't be sitting here. But I think that the most crucial part right now is that the EU rethinks its role. The recent deal that was proposed in Tunis by the EU, led by von der Leyen, Meloni, and Rutke, a few weeks ago, was 1 billion euros to Tunis to so-called, stabilize the economy and to manage migration on behalf of the EU, because of course they're very afraid that Tunisian economy will collapse, and then thousands and thousands will arrive to Europe. So they have, created this, in my opinion, a very desperate deal to put kind of a plug in. But the problem is, as we're seeing now, the tensions are exploding in Tunisia because of continuous, EU pressure. So I think what's important now is that the EU has to rethink its role in these so-called partnerships, because They are not partnerships. They're very unequal. There is an asymmetric power here, where you have, for instance, Tunisia, a small country in deep political economic crisis, and then you have the EU, which is a huge power actor, and then they claim it to be basically a partnership, but the deal is completely, dependent and contingent on migration control to just benefit the EU. And it's not looking at, for instance, the infrastructure in Tunisia, if they have the resources to manage migration in the first place, if there is a political will to make any of these policies or changes, because it's very an important point, right, in Tunisia, is that there is no national or legal framework on migration or asylum. So all the migrants in Tunisia, including refugees, do not have any, either legal status or protection or anything. So they're just there living in legal and existential limbo. And there are more and more of them because the EU is, of course, funding and then strengthening the coast guards that are intercepting tens of thousands and bringing them back to Tunisia. So they are basically creating these kind of open air prisons, not just in Tunisia. We have them in Libya already with the detention systems, in Algeria, in Morocco. So there's a whole region that are being confined, and it's only a matter of time before these create local tensions and pressure cooker situations, as we're seeing just the recent few days in Tunisia, how this has created a humanitarian and human rights crisis. And a lot of it is only going to increase migration because people are going to be fleeing because it's not a safe place to be. So again, the policies are creating these conditions, and then people will of course move and migrate to security and to a safe place. And for many, for them, it's crossing the Mediterranean and arriving to Europe that becomes the only issue. And I think what's very important now is again, these kinds of partnerships are not. Instead, I think it's important that the EU focuses on long-term solutions and true collaboration, and not these kinds of so-called collaborations where everything is on EU terms. And so, of course, to also avoid the deaths at sea, increased sea and rescue operations again, and not criminalizing NGOs that are, trying to save and rescue people from dying. Another issue is that many of these, increased irregular journeys are happening because there are no longer any legal ways of entering. So, for instance, visa opportunities and just asylum applications are not attainable for thousands of people. So that also needs to be opened up for, so people will not go through smugglers and dangerous routes for safety, but that they can apply for a visa or apply for asylum where they are or nearby, instead of making all of these long journeys.
I think you made a very important point in this moment. A lot of far right and right wing parties in Europe today focus on illegal migration, portraying these migrating people as criminals. But the fact is that many of those people have actually no legal chance to apply for arrival in Europe. Even though even if they could work here, even if there could be options for them to settle here peacefully, they are just deprived of options to arrive in, let's say, safe way. But before I come to the final conclusion, I wanted to ask you about integration policies. For migration policies are one part, and then they should have their logical continuation in integration policies. Also, because that this is basically on what the far right is now winning the political capital, by claiming that we can't let people in because they are not integrating. So I would like to ask you if there is any attempt in the European Union to have a coordinated guidelines how to integrate the newcomers, how to create good living conditions for everybody in Europe, because Europe needs newcomers. European societies are getting older and older, so closing door to migrants is no solution in any dimension, from humanitarian to this very logical, pragmatical level.
Yeah, thank you for this very, very good question and good points, because you are absolutely right. Europe is already needing workforce on many level, also especially as you say the care sector, because of an increasingly eldering population across Europe. So I think your point is so important, but I think what we saw in the aftermath of the Ukraine war, the Russian war in Ukraine, is actually what's supposed to be happening. At least, for instance, I can give you the example of Denmark, was that they basically welcomed thousands and thousands of Ukrainian who were fleeing, also mainly, of course, women and their children. And what happened was they were given, of course, shelter and assistance upon arrival, but very, very quickly after, the children were allowed to enter Danish schools. The women were allowed to enter the formal labor market, and given access to that, and given access to teaching Danish classes and Danish lessons. So there were very many efforts into integrating Ukrainian refugees very quickly after upon arrival. And this is in very, very stark contrast to what happened with the Syrian war and the Syrian refugees who are still in Denmark in asylum centers, with no access of, accessing society, accessing labor market or schools, and not able to integrate fully into society. And your point about, how right wing politicians are using this to say they cannot be integrated, this will cause, disruption, is because of the policies not allowing them to. But as we're seeing with the case of the Ukrainians, many have been giving full access to societies in the EU, and access to work and so on. And it has proven to actually work, because many also Syrians and Afghanis and so on also want that, but have not been able because of, I would say, discriminatory policies. And I think the Ukrainian case is a very good case, because it shows how different these policies are, and responses have been, and that the Ukrainian response has been the correct one. And this is the one that should have been used with all refugees in all crisis situations. And I think we can learn from it. And if there is in the future, I don't hope, we'll see another kind of influx of refugees in the future again. But I think integrating them into society is important, and one of the most crucial aspects. And also from a cost benefit analysis, as you say, it's something that many European states will need in the future, closing its borders on migration, or keeping people in asylum centers rest of their lives without any possibility of integrating into society is not a solution for anyone, not the people who are just waiting in uncertainty, and not for the societies they're living in.
Looking at the European migration policy can make everybody ask a serious question. How serious is European Union when claiming to be the defender of values, democracy, personal liberties, and so on? Seeing how much money was pumped into deals with undemocratic regimes just for the sake of stopping the desperate migrants to cross the Mediterranean, or seeing the closed detention centers, makes us think that the European migration policy came to a dead end, and that we need something new, a new approach that takes into consideration how the situation really looks on the ground. For migrants will not stop coming to Europe if there are no conditions for good living in their countries of origin, which is unfortunately the case of Syria, Afghanistan, Congo, a lot of countries everywhere in the world. Perhaps it is good that a new migration policies are being discussed in European Union, but as our expert proved, there is still a lot to be changed in the European approach to migration issue. Thank you, Ahlam, for being with us. Thank you to everybody who listened to the talk. I remind you that you can find Cross Border Talks on YouTube, SoundCloud, Spotify, as well as in our social media. I encourage you to support the project and to subscribe not to lose any of the episodes that we will transmit in the future. Thank you very much again and have a good day.